The black mourning crepe had gone stiff at the edges, and when Prudence Hale laid her fingers on it, it crackled like old leaves in frost. Even at midday, the Duchess's corridor smelled of shut air, cold ashes, beeswax, and the faint sourness of rooms that had not been properly opened in far too long. A great house may keep many kinds of silence, but this was the worst kind, the kind that had been ordered. Gideon, Duke of Wintermere, had made that order in the first raw days after Lady Margery was laid in the ground. Her whole wing was to be shrouded, every window hidden, every mirror covered. No servant was to draw a curtain, lift a veil, or set so much as a vase straight without express command. And because grief wears authority very convincingly when it speaks in a duke's voice, the house obeyed. Houses like Wintermere always did. They obeyed even when obedience made a place feel less like mourning and more like burial. Prudence had been at Wintermere only 7 months, and even that was long enough to learn the shape of things. She was a charwoman, which is to say, one of the women who kept a grand house from sinking under its own grandeur. She scrubbed stair corners no one saw, shook soot from grates, hauled slop, polished brass, and took the dirty work that rank never notices until it stops being done. She was past 30, plain-faced, strong in the wrists, and so accustomed to being looked through that she had made a kind of peace with it. Yet there are women whom life trains into meekness, and there are women whom it trains into plain sense. Prudence belonged to the second sort. So she noticed what others had grown used to. She noticed that the boards along the veiled windows had begun to swell with damp, that the nursery at the end of the corridor held the smell of old linen and stale tears, that dust lay thick on a little painted horse beneath a sheet, that the darkness in those rooms was no longer honoring the dead woman at all. It was swallowing what had belonged to her. Below stairs they spoke of the Duke in lowered voices, a stern man, a grieving man, a man who had once crossed whole counties in a night to fetch his wife a doctor and afterward had never forgiven the dawn for coming without her. Prudence did not mock that. She knew sorrow well enough to be respectful of it. But she also knew this much, and knew it in her bones. Grief can turn selfish when no one dares to challenge it. That afternoon the housekeeper sent her alone to wipe the skirting in the forbidden corridor, because even sacred gloom gathers dirt. Prudence came with her pail, her rag, and her quiet feet. She worked in the half-dark until she reached the first of the veiled mirrors, tall as a door and smothered in black. Beside it hung a window under the same funereal cloth. For a long moment she stood there listening, to the distant tick of a clock, to wind worrying the outer stone, to the small hard sound of her own breathing. Then, very gently, she lifted one corner of the cloth. A blade of winter light slid through and touched the floorboards like something alive. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe and stay with me, because Prudence had not yet done the dangerous thing. The narrow strip of brightness lay across the floorboards like a trespass. Prudence should have dropped the cloth at once, should have let the room sink back into its proper dimness. And yet she stood with that one corner pinched between finger and thumb, watching dust rise and turn gold in the beam. It was astonishing the way a little light could make neglect visible all at once. The toys under their sheets looked less like memorials and more like things abandoned. The carpet showed the pale ghosts of chair legs where no one had sat for months. Even the air changed. It stirred against her face, cold from the glass, and brought with it the faint smell of damp plaster and dried lavender hidden somewhere in the room. Then a voice behind her said, very quietly, "Don't let it fall." Prudence turned so fast the ring of keys at her waist struck the pail. In the doorway stood an old woman in a black gown, rubbed shiny at cuff and hem, her white cap tied so neatly it made her lined face look sterner than it was. This was Mrs. Bell, the nursery nurse, though no one called her that to her face. In great houses, old servants earn their titles as surely as nobles do. Prudence had seen her only in passing before, moving along passages with the slow certainty of someone who belonged more deeply than furniture. "I beg pardon," Prudence said at once. "I was only—" "I can see what you were only doing." Mrs. Bell stepped in, and when the light touched her features, it showed eyes red-rimmed from years of swallowing grief without spectacle. She put one thin hand by the sill, as if greeting an old friend. "Her ladyship would have thanked you for that much." Prudence said nothing. A woman in service learns when silence is wiser than speech. But Mrs. Bell, having begun, seemed unable to stop. Some truths wait too long in the throat, and then come out all in one quiet flood. "Lady Margery hated shuttered rooms," she said. "As a girl, she was once shut in a sick room by an anxious aunt, and after that she could never bear curtains drawn by day. Even in the worst weather she wanted air. Honest air, she called it. Drove the maids wild in winter with it." Mrs. Bell gave a brief breath that might once have been a laugh. "And snowdrops. She loved snowdrops beyond reason. Said they were proof the earth remembered spring even when people did not." At that, Prudence glanced toward the tall window. Beyond the warped glass, she could just make out the south side of the wing, the stone border beneath it, the tangle there silvered with frost. Nothing more. The black cloth still smothered most of the pane. Mrs. Bell followed her look. "There's a little bed below these rooms," she said. "She planted it with her own hands. Haven't seen it proper since the Duke had all this turned into a tomb." Then the old woman's mouth tightened, and she added, "And if you repeat that, I shall deny it till judgment." Before Prudence could answer, there came the patter of quick feet in the corridor outside, then a girl's voice, hushed and urgent. "Belle? Belle, are you in there? Rowan says the room is bright." And Mrs. Bell went still, because children were not supposed to be here at all. Mrs. Bell moved quicker than Prudence would have thought those old bones could manage. She crossed the room, caught the door before it swung wide, and opened it only a hand's breadth. Through the gap slipped a girl of perhaps 9, pale-haired and straight-backed, with a look in her face that belonged more properly to a woman twice her age. Behind her came a little boy in one untidy stocking, his curls flattened on one side, as if he had lately fought with a pillow and lost. "Clara," said the nurse under her breath. "Master Rowan, you were told." "I know what we were told," the girl said, and her voice had the brittle patience of a child who has heard too many rules and too few reasons. Then she saw the stripe of brightness across the nursery floor and stopped altogether. "Oh." The boy did not stop. He ran past them, dropped to his knees in the beam, and spread his hands over the warmed boards as if it were a fire. "It's here," he whispered. "The sun got in." Children, you know, will speak truth in the plainest words and thereby shame a whole household of careful liars. Prudence stood back with the black cloth still in her hand, suddenly feeling less like a servant with a pail and more like an intruder in something private and holy. But Clara did not look at her with outrage. She looked at the opened corner of the window the way thirsty people look at water. "Was it you?" she asked. Prudence glanced at Mrs. Bell. The old nurse gave the smallest nod. "I only lifted it a little, miss." "A little is enough," Clara said. Then, after a pause, "Mama hated when they shut the curtains in daytime. She said rooms went sad if you did that." The child moved to the window and touched the edge of the cloth with careful fingers. "Papa says this is respect." There are moments when a servant must remember every rung of the ladder and keep her own feet on the lowest one. Prudence knew that. She also knew when silence starts to become a kind of lie. "Your father is grieving, miss," she said gently. "And grieving folks sometimes mistake what keeps them company for what ought to keep everyone else." Clara turned that over with grave attention. Rowan, still kneeling in the brightness, tipped his face up and asked, "If Mama was afraid of dark rooms, why did Papa put her in one?" Mrs. Bell closed her eyes for a moment. The wind pressed faintly at the pane. Somewhere farther down the passage, a door shut with the muffled thud peculiar to deep-carpeted houses. Prudence felt the whole weight of Wintermere in that sound. The rules, the walls, the habits of obedience that had outlived sense. The nurse knelt beside the little boy. "Your Mama is not in these rooms, love," she said quietly. "Only her things. And your Papa—" She stopped because loyalty had its chains too. "Your Papa has been very unhappy." Clara gave a small, sharp breath. "Then he may be unhappy in daylight. I am tired of creeping." That was Lady Margery in her, Prudence thought at once, though she had never seen the dead Duchess's face. Some spirits leave likenesses stronger than portraits. The girl stepped closer to the window. Her hand tightened on the hanging cloth. "Can you open it more?" she asked. And from the corridor outside came the heavy, measured tread of a man who did not ask permission of any door in the house. The tread came nearer, measured and hard, and every person in that nursery knew the sound of authority before the door even opened. Prudence had just enough time to set down her rag and let the hanging cloth fall halfway, which was an act of instinct more than prudence, for once light has entered a room, it cannot be made innocent again by covering the window after. It was not the Duke. It was Mr. Vale, the steward, tall, spare, exact in every line, with iron-gray hair brushed as flat as duty and a mouth that seemed made for withholding comfort. He stopped on the threshold and took in the whole scene at a glance. Clara by the window, Rowan kneeling in the bright patch on the floor, Mrs. Bell pale and stiff, Prudence standing with a strip of black fabric in her hand like evidence. There are men who need noise to establish command. Mr. Vale had the quieter sort. He could chill a room simply by looking as though it had disappointed him. "What," he said, "is the meaning of this?" Rowan answered first, because small children have no reverence for hierarchy when they are pleased. "The sun came back." His eyes did not leave Prudence. "I did not address you, Master Rowan." Then to her, "You were sent here to clean the skirtings." "I was," Prudence said. "And yet you have taken it upon yourself to interfere with His Grace's standing order." Mrs. Bell drew breath to speak, but the steward lifted one hand without looking at her. "No. I should like to hear from Mrs. Hale how a charwoman came to think her judgment above the Duke's." It was an ugly thing, that question, because it was built to make any answer sound insolent. Prudence felt the children's eyes on her, and the old nurse's fear, and the cold air slipping under the cloth. She knew the wise course. Apologize. Blame accident. Lower her head and call the room dark again. A woman without money does not often get the luxury of truth. Still, sometimes truth arrives wearing work shoes and will not be turned out. "The room was stifling, sir," she said. "The boards are damp, the air close, and the children—" "The children," said the steward, "ought not to be here at all." Clara straightened at that. "Then perhaps the rule is foolish." Mrs. Bell shut her eyes briefly, for one cannot clap a hand over a young lady's honesty the way one can over a candle flame. But the words hung there, clear and dangerous. His face sharpened. "Lady Clara, you will return to the schoolroom." "No." That small word made the whole passage outside seem to lean in. Prudence saw it then, plain as day. The grief upstairs had curdled into a discipline everyone was expected to kneel to, even the motherless children of the woman it claimed to honor. Large houses are very good at calling that kind of surrender respect. Mr. Vale stepped farther in. "Mrs. Hale, leave us." Prudence did not move. He looked at her with cold disbelief. "Did you not hear me?" "I heard you, sir." Her voice was steady, though her palms had gone damp. "But if the cloth goes back over that window now, the young master will scream, and the young lady will fight you, and Mrs. Bell will be left to mend all of it after. So if you mean it re-hung, you had best do it with your own hands." For one long second, nobody spoke. Then Clara reached up, caught the loosened edge of the curtain, and pulled it another inch aside, just as more footsteps sounded in the corridor beyond, heavier than the steward's, slower, and impossible to mistake. Everyone in the room heard those steps and understood at once that this was different. Mr. Vale's tread carried duty. This carried ownership. It came along the corridor with the grave, unhurried weight of one before whom doors opened, lamps were straightened, voices lowered, and trouble very often learned to disguise itself. Mrs. Bell rose first. Clara let go of the cloth, but did not step back from the window. Rowan, still in the patch of light, looked up with his hair all awry and his hands full of brightness. Prudence stood where she was, every nerve in her body suddenly aware of the black strip hanging from her fingers. It felt coarse now, almost greasy with age, and far too visible. A servant's mistake can often be hidden under another task. This one stood there, a confession. The footsteps halted just beyond the door. No one spoke. Then came a man's voice from the corridor, low and worn and perfectly controlled. "Why are my children in this wing?" Prudence had never heard Gideon, Duke of Wintermere, speak before. She had seen him only at a distance, in the court or on the front steps, a dark coat, a still figure, a face turned inward upon itself. The voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Grief, when it has rank behind it, learns to command in a murmur. Mr. Vale moved at once, eager perhaps to place himself between disorder and the man who hated it. He stepped into the doorway, blocking the room from fuller view. "Your Grace," he said, "there has been a small breach of instructions. I was just restoring matters." A pause followed. Prudence could hear the faint hiss of air at the loosened window, the little drum of Rowan's heel against the floorboards, the far-off rattle of a coal scuttle somewhere deep below stairs. Great moments in houses often arrive with ridiculous small sounds attached to them. Life, you see, does not stop its ordinary business because the heart has begun to pound. "Restoring," said the Duke. Mr. Vale shifted, and in that shift, Prudence caught her first proper glimpse of Gideon. Only part of him, framed by the doorway and shadow beyond. A tall man in black, one gloved hand resting on the carved lintel as though he would not quite bring himself to cross it. His face lay mostly in half-light, but even so she saw the austerity of it, the tired mouth, the hollowness under the eyes. He looked as though he had slept badly for a very long time and called it fortitude. Clara spoke before the steward could answer. "Papa, don't send the son away." Mr. Vale turned sharply. "Lady Clara—" "No." Her voice trembled only a little. "I mean it. Don't." The Duke did not reply at once. Prudence could not tell what he had seen from where he stood. Only the child, perhaps. Only the fallen edge of cloth. Only enough to irritate him. Yet some instinct in him seemed to have fixed on the room beyond Mr. Vale's shoulder, because he stayed there, and he did not dismiss them with the brisk coldness everyone had expected. "What has been done?" he asked at last. And before anyone else could speak, Rowan lifted both small palms into the beam on the floor and said, with solemn delight, "She let the day in." That single childish sentence seemed to alter the air more than the opened window had done. For a moment, no one answered him. The Duke stood beyond the threshold, and though Prudence still saw only part of his face, she saw enough to know the words had struck somewhere unguarded. Children do that. They go past the armor by mistake and call it honesty. Mr. Vale recovered first. "Your Grace, Mrs. Hale exceeded her instructions. I was in the act of having the cloth restored." "Were you?" Gideon said. He stepped into the room then, just far enough for the light to find him. Prudence lowered her eyes at once, because servants do, but not before she saw the whole of his expression. He was younger than sorrow had made him look from a distance, and harsher close at hand. His coat was plain black, his cravat unadorned, and his face had the drawn, bloodless look of someone who had spent many months indoors with grief for company. He did not look at Prudence first. He looked at the beam below, at Rowan crouched in it, at Clara by the hanging cloth, and only after that at the window itself, half freed from its shroud. It is a dangerous thing when a room begins telling the truth before its master is ready to hear it. "Clara," he said, and his voice had gentled by a fraction. "Why are you here?" "Because it was dark," she answered at once, "and because Belle said Mama used to keep this room open." Mrs. Bell dropped a curtsy that was old habit and old courage together. "Her ladyship disliked a close room, sir. That is true." Mr. Vale cut in with quiet urgency. "The question is not her Grace's former preferences. The question is discipline." Gideon's mouth tightened, though whether at the steward's tone or the word itself, Prudence could not tell. He had the air of one being asked to choose between two pains and resenting both. Then his gaze shifted to Prudence at last. "You," he said, "look at me." She did. A charwoman is not often invited to meet a duke's eyes. Most of the time such women pass below notice, which is a kind of safety until the day it is not. Prudence stood straight, her rough hands still darkened by soot at the knuckles, a rag tucked into one apron string, the torn edge of black mourning crepe hanging beside her like a charge laid before a court. She did not tremble, though she wanted to. Fear is no disgrace. It is simply unpleasant. "Did you lift that cloth?" he asked. "Yes, Your Grace." "Knowing my order?" "Yes." Mr. Vale made a small sound of vindication, but Gideon silenced it with the merest turn of his head. He kept his eyes on Prudence. Why? There it was, the question that can undo a life depending on how it is answered. A woman in service can survive many things, cold, long hours, hunger, insult, but she cannot often survive being thought impertinent. Prudence knew that as surely as she knew the smell of lye soap or the ache of winter in the wrists. She could apologize and perhaps save herself. She could say the cloth slipped. She could say the child touched it first. Lies come easily when they are trying to keep bread in the cupboard. Instead, she said, "Because the room is going bad, sir." Even Mr. Vale drew breath at that. Prudence heard her own voice continue, plain and steady, as if somebody braver had stepped into it for the moment. "The boards are swelling by the sill. The air is stale. There is damp in the paper near the nursery corner, and the young ones are afraid of the dark you've left here." Clara whispered, "Yes," into the silence. Gideon stayed still. A pulse worked once in his cheek. Outside, wind rubbed a bare branch against the glass with a dry, scratching sound. Then he said very softly, "Leave us all, at once." And no one in the room knew whether he meant to spare Prudence or destroy her without witnesses. They obeyed him because there was nothing else to do. Mr. Vale went first, stiff with offended order. Mrs. Bell gathered Rowan up from the floor, though the child twisted in her arms and reached one hand back toward the patch of light as though being carried from something precious. Clara walked out on her own, chin high, that dangerous little line between her brows still there. She paused beside Prudence only long enough to whisper, "Don't say sorry if you're not." And then she too was gone. The door closed after them with a soft, padded click that sounded, in that vast house, unnaturally final. Prudence and the Duke were left together in the half-open nursery, with the loosened cloth stirring faintly at the window and the smell of cold air slipping in over old dust and dried lavender. For one long moment, Gideon did not speak. He moved farther into the room instead, slowly, like a man entering water that he expects to be freezing. His eyes went to the painted horse under its sheet, the little chair near the hearth, the cradle pushed against the far wall and covered over as though childhood itself had been put away. Then he looked back at the blade of daylight across the floor. "You have been here 7 months," he said at last, as if reading from an account book somewhere in his mind. "You came from the village lodging house after Mrs. Kemp left." "Yes, Your Grace. And in those 7 months you concluded you understood my house better than I do." The words were sharp, but his tone was tired rather than cruel, and that, oddly enough, made them more dangerous. Anger can be met. Weariness sits closer to truth. Prudence kept her hands folded before her apron. "No, sir." "No?" He looked at the torn edge of cloth. "It has the appearance of yes." A lesser woman might have reached for safety then. Prudence had been a lesser woman often enough in the world's estimation, and knew exactly how such moments were meant to go. But she also knew that when a thing has already gone as far wrong as this one had, timid lies only polish the wrongness and hand it back. "I think," she said carefully, "that there are parts of a house a master stops seeing because other people see them for him. Drafts, rot, dust in high corners, children growing frightened in their own nursery." His face changed a little at that last word, only a little. Still, she saw it. "You speak boldly." "I speak plain." That nearly drew something like a bitter smile from him, though it did not quite arrive. He took off one glove, finger by finger, as if he were buying himself time not to answer too quickly. His hands were thinner than she would have expected in a man of his size. There was no ring on them now, only a pale mark where one had long been worn. "She was happy in these rooms," he said suddenly, and his voice had dropped into a lower register, something less public and more dangerous because it was nearer the wound. "My wife. The children were noisy here. She used to complain of the noise and then go still whenever it stopped. I shut this wing because I could not bear." He broke off and looked toward the window instead. Could not bear what? The emptiness? The memory? The sight of life continuing without permission? Prudence did not ask. Servants survive by understanding which truths belong to other people's mouths. Gideon stepped past her then, close enough that she caught the faint scent of cold wool and rain on him, and put his bare hand on the loosened curtain. When he drew it back another inch, winter light poured farther in, and fell full across the shrouded mirror at the far wall. The light reached the covered glass and stopped there, as if even daylight had manners in that room and would go no farther without leave. Gideon stood looking at the shrouded mirror for several seconds. Prudence could almost feel the struggle in him without understanding all of it. Men are rarely taught to confess fear plainly, least of all men who have inherited long galleries, tenants, duties, and the miserable old lesson that command must always wear a composed face. So fear often chooses another costume. It calls itself order. It calls itself reverence. It calls itself fidelity to the dead, when what it truly wants is not to be confronted by the living. "You may go," he said at last. Prudence felt the words in her stomach before she answered. "Yes, Your Grace." She bent to take up her pail, but as she did, her sleeve brushed the edge of the hanging cloth. The black fold slipped, just a little, barely more than a hand's width, yet it was enough. The mirror, exposed in that narrow strip, caught the window's pale gleam and sent it back into the room, only enough to make the air seem sharper, the silence less muffled. And in that same instant, the Duke saw himself. Prudence saw it happen before she lowered her eyes. His whole body gave the smallest start, so slight another person might have missed it. But she was a woman used to watching for small things, the drip from a cracked ewer, the tremor in a candle, the moment a child is about to cry. She knew the look of someone ambushed by truth. The glass showed him what the household only whispered of, a face worn thin by sleeplessness, a mouth dragged stern by habit, grief set into the skin so long it had almost become character. He turned away at once. "Cover it," he said. Prudence should have done so instantly. That was the safe path. Instead, she glanced toward the window, because the open slit had widened with the shifting cloth, and there, below the sill and out beyond the stone wall, something white had caught her eye. At first she thought it frost. Then the breeze moved, and the white nodded. Snowdrops. A whole drift of them, half hidden under winter grass, their small bent heads bright against the dark earth. Lady Margery's flowers had come up after all, unseen beneath the veiled windows and unadmired by the house that had once belonged to the woman who planted them.
"Your Grace,"
Prudence said before caution could stop her. "Look." He did not want to, that was plain, but the word had escaped in such a tone that even he, startled out of his own command by the mirror and whatever it had shown him, followed her gaze almost despite himself. The patch below the nursery wall lay pale under the weak afternoon sky. The blooms were small. Their courage was not. They had pushed through frozen ground with no witness, no permission, no ceremony, and now they shone in the little lane of light she had opened. Gideon stepped nearer the window. "My wife planted those," he said, and the voice that came from him then sounded younger, stripped of some hardness. "She said they arrived before spring had earned the right to call itself spring." Prudence did not answer. Some memories are like skittish birds. The noise of another person can startle them into flight. He stood there a long while, looking down into the garden. Then he spoke again, still not turning. "Mr. Vale was right in one respect. You have disobeyed me." "Yes, sir." "And yet—" He put his bare fingers to the window latch as if the metal itself had become a problem requiring thought. "And yet my children came where I forbade them, and the nurse has lied by omission, and you have the look of a woman who would do this same thing again if set back in the room tomorrow." Prudence, who had never been good at ornamental falsehood, said quietly, "I believe I would." At that, he turned to face her fully, and someone outside the door gave a startled cry. The cry came from the passage, sharp and quickly smothered, the sort of sound made by someone who has seen more than was intended and wished at once to unsee it. Gideon's expression closed over at once, like a door pushed hard to. Whatever had opened in him at the window shut behind his eyes with practiced speed. "Who is there?" he said. The door eased inward by an inch. A young housemaid stood beyond it, red-cheeked with fright, one hand pressed to her apron. Behind her, almost over her shoulder, Prudence could make out the anxious shape of Mrs. Bell and the pale oval of Clara's face. So they had not gone far. Of course they had not. In a house like Wintermere, fear was always listening at the keyhole. "Beg pardon, Your Grace," the girl stammered. "Mr. Vale said. He said to wait in case the cloth must be rehung. At that, the Duke looked from the maid to the loosened window, to the slice of mirror still bare, and then back to Prudence. She could feel the whole balance of the moment tremble. He had been startled into honesty for half a minute, perhaps less. Now rank had returned to the room with witnesses at its heels, and men bred to authority rarely permit themselves tenderness when lesser eyes are on them. "Send Mr. Vale in," he said. The maid vanished. Clara did not. She remained where Prudence could see just the edge of her shoulder beyond the door jamb, stubborn as a nail in old oak. Rowan's small whisper drifted in from the hall. "Will he make it dark again?" No one answered him. Mr. Vale entered almost immediately, composed, ready, one of those men who can smell hesitation and hurry in to give it rules. He stopped just inside the nursery and took in the window, the strip of revealed glass, the Duke standing beside both, and Prudence still there where she had no right to be. A lesser steward might have looked uncertain then. Mr. Vale looked vindicated. "Your Grace," he said, "shall I have the room restored?" There are questions asked for information, and there are questions asked to force a hand. This was the second kind. Gideon did not reply at once. He moved away from the window, and in moving, he placed himself between the light and the room. The snowdrops vanished from sight. The little bright lane across the floor dimmed. Prudence felt the loss physically, absurd though that was. You would think daylight, having once entered, could not seem so fragile. Yet in houses ruled by grief, even the sun can appear to be on sufferance. Then the Duke said, in a voice gone formal again, "Mrs. Hale acted without leave." "Yes, Your Grace," said Mr. Vale. "She has interfered with a direct order." "Yes, Your Grace." The steward's satisfaction was almost soundless, but Prudence heard it all the same. Mrs. Bell, outside, gave a small, helpless intake of breath. Clara shifted in the passage as though she meant to burst in and speak, and only the nurse's hand must have kept her back. Prudence stood very still. She had known, from the first moment her fingers touched that old cloth, what this might cost. Bread, shelter, a reference. In winter, those things are not trifles. They are the difference between dignity and desperation. Still, she found that she was not ashamed. Frightened, yes, bitterly so, but not ashamed. Gideon turned fully toward her. "Mrs. Hale," he said, and every listening soul in and beyond the doorway went silent. "You are dismissed from service at Wintermere, as of this hour." And Clara, out in the passage, made a fierce little sound as if she meant to go to war. The words had scarcely left his mouth when Clara pushed past the door and into the nursery, as if she had forgotten altogether that she was a duke's daughter and he was her father. "You cannot," she said. Her face had gone white with fury, and because she was still only a child, the fury sat on her like something too large for her bones, and therefore all the more painful to see. Rowan came after her, not brave in the same sharp way, but desperate, his lower lip already shaking. Mrs. Bell followed with the stricken look of someone who knew the earth was opening under every proper rule in the house, and could not, for once, find it in herself to force the rules back into place. "Clara," Gideon said. "No," she answered, and this time the word broke. "You always say no and shut doors and send people away, and now you're sending away the only person who opened anything." Mr. Vale stepped forward at once. "Lady Clara, you forget yourself." "I remember Mamma," she snapped. That landed like a dropped weight. Even the steward fell silent. The slack cloth stirred faintly at the window. The pale strip of light still lay across the floorboards, smaller now in the turning afternoon, but stubborn. It had become, without anyone meaning it to, a sort of witness. Rowan ran to Prudence and caught her skirt in both fists. "Don't go," he said, pressing his face against the coarse stuff of her apron, as if she were a wall against weather. "Please don't go. It's bad when it's dark." Prudence closed her eyes for half a heartbeat. Dismissal she could bear. Hunger, perhaps. Uncertainty, too. What was harder was the warm weight of a child trusting her, as if trust were simple and safe to accept. She laid a soot-roughened hand lightly on his hair and said, as steadily as she could, "Hush now, lamb." Mrs. Bell looked from the children to the Duke. Something in the old woman's face settled, like a servant laying down caution after carrying it too many years. "Sir," she said quietly, "with respect, her ladyship could not abide shuttered rooms. After the fever when she was a girl, shadow frightened her. She would sit by an open casement in winter rather than let them draw the curtains. You know she would. Gideon's gaze shifted to the nurse. Belle? I know what I risk in speaking. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. But if the children are frightened, and the rooms are souring, and her flowers are blooming outside unseen, then I believe the wrong has already been done, and not by the woman you have just turned off. Mr. Vale made an outraged sound. This is intolerable. No, said Clara, tears bright on her face and anger still burning through them. This is true. Gideon looked as though every person in the room had suddenly begun speaking a language he had once known and then forced himself to forget. Yet pride, especially grieving pride, does not yield at the first knock. He drew himself up. Mrs. Hale will go, he said. The wing remains under my order. At that, Clara crossed the room in 3 quick steps and planted herself flat against the loosened window hanging, a hand gripping the cloth. If they cover it again, she said, breathing hard, I will tear it down myself. And nobody in that room, not even her father, believed for a second that she was bluffing. For a breath or two, nobody moved. Clara stood with her back against the hanging cloth, a hand clenched in it, her small chest rising and falling hard. Rowan still held Prudence's skirt and looked from face to face with that naked terror children have when they know something beloved is being taken and do not understand why grown people can continue speaking in calm voices while it happens. Mr. Vale found his composure first, because men like him always do when there is an opening for procedure. Lady Clara, he said, step away from the window. She did not. Clara, Gideon's voice came lower now, more dangerous for being quieter. Obey me. And there it was, the old collision in its plainest form. A father asking obedience. A grieving man defending the shape his sorrow had taken. A child, motherless and heartsick, refusing to be educated any further in darkness. Large houses like Wintermere are built of stone, timber, and inherited money, but the true walls in them are often only this, one person's will set against another's need, with everyone lower down expected to pretend the difference is duty. No, she said again, though her lip trembled. You cannot keep taking things away and calling it proper. Mrs. Bell made a faint sound, half prayer and half despair. Prudence knew then that the room had tipped past any servant's power to mend. Whatever happened next would not be kept to this nursery. It would run through the house by supper, through the village by morning, because scandal in a great family travels by the same invisible channels as heat and smoke. It finds every crack. Gideon looked at his daughter for a long moment. There was anger in him, yes, weariness too, but also something worse for him because it was less familiar. Uncertainty. He had come into the room expecting defiance from a servant. He had found it also in his child. And grief is poorly equipped to argue with innocence when innocence has facts on its side. Belle, he said at last, without taking his eyes from Clara, remove the children. No! Rowan cried at once and clung tighter. Prudence bent and gently loosened his fingers one by one. Hush now, she murmured. You must go with nurse. I won't! You must. He looked up at her then with wet lashes and such betrayed confusion that something twisted low in her chest. She had no claim on him, she knew that. Servant women are forever being borrowed by children and then returned to obscurity as if the heart were not involved in the exchange. Even so, she cupped his cheek for a second with her rough hand and said, Mind your sister for me. That reached him where command had not. He swallowed hard and let Mrs. Bell gather him. Clara stayed still until Gideon crossed the room himself. Prudence thought for one wild instant that he meant to tear the cloth from her grip and plunge the room back into dimness then and there. Instead, he stopped before the child and spoke so low only those nearest heard it. "You are very like your mother when you are determined." Clara's face changed. The anger stayed, but wonder entered it too, because he had not said her mother's name aloud to her in weeks. "And she," said Clara in a shaking whisper, "would have hated this." Gideon shut his eyes, only for a second. Still, Prudence saw it. When he opened them again, he stepped back, and Clara let Mrs. Bell take her hand at last. The children were led away. Mr. Vale turned toward the window, ready now to restore the mourning crepe with the zeal of a man convinced order had won. Then Gideon said, without looking at any of them, "Not until she is gone." And Prudence understood that he meant the cloth, or perhaps himself, and could not yet tell which. The room emptied after that in the peculiar, strained quiet that follows a command nobody likes and everybody obeys. Mr. Vale withdrew first, though not far. Prudence could feel him waiting just beyond the door like a locked cabinet full of disapproval. Mrs. Bell led the children away by degrees rather than at once, Rowan dragging his heels, Clara turning back twice, her face still wet and furious. Gideon did not look at them. Whether he could not or would not, Prudence had no way of knowing. When they were gone, he stood with one hand on the mantel and the other hanging loose at his side, as if even that posture had cost him something. The nursery felt larger without the children in it, and sadder too. A room made for young voices should never be this quiet. It offends the purpose of things. Prudence had always believed that. Chairs are for sitting in, hearths for warming hands, windows for letting in weather and light. When people force objects to serve grief instead of life, the objects bear witness in their own mute ways. Damp in the boards, dust on the toys, stale air, silence. "You may collect your things from the attic room," Gideon said at length. "Mr. Vale will see your wages settled through the week." It was meant, perhaps, as fairness. To Prudence it sounded like distance nailed back into place. "Yes, Your Grace." She bent for her pail. The handle was cold and slick against her palm. She meant to go without another word. A servant who has been dismissed gains nothing by lingering. Yet when she straightened, she found him looking not at her, but at the nursery wall beside the window, where the paper had puckered ever so slightly from the damp she had named. His eyes rested there, as if her plain account of rot had lodged where richer people's courtesies had failed. "My children fear this wing," he said, almost to himself. Prudence hesitated. "Yes, sir." He gave a short breath through his nose, not quite a laugh. "You answer very directly for a woman who has just lost her place." "I have lost it whether I answer plain or soft." At that he did look at her, and for one heartbeat the severity of his face altered. He was too tired for kindness. Into recognition, perhaps, the sort that comes when one lonely creature hears truth from another and resents needing it. "Do you think me cruel, Mrs. Hale?" The question was so unexpected that it stripped the room of all the usual forms. Dukes are not meant to ask charwomen what sort of men they are. The world is arranged to save them from such inquiries. Prudence stood with her pail in one hand and the torn strip of crepe still trailing from the other, and understood that whatever answer she gave would follow him longer than her dismissal would follow her. "No, sir," she said after a moment. "I think you are grieving, and have made the house do it with you." His mouth tightened. She had gone too far. She knew it at once. But before he could answer, the wind freshened outside, pushing through the loosened gap in the curtain. The cloth stirred again. So did the uncovered edge of the mirror. A pale shard of reflection flashed across the room and struck the framed watercolor above the mantel. Gideon turned. It was Lady Margery in the painting. seated on the south lawn in a straw hat, one gloved hand lifted against the sun, the snowdrop border at her feet just beginning to bloom. And Gideon went still in a way Prudence had not yet seen from him, as though some long barred door in the man had been touched from the other side. He stared at the painting as if it had answered him in a voice no one else could hear. Prudence followed his gaze and saw what he saw, though not as he saw it. Lady Margery sat in summer white beneath a wide hat, one ribbon loosened by the breeze, laughter caught somehow even in watercolor, and at the hem of the lawn a drift of snowdrops shone against green. The artist had painted the flowers carelessly, almost as an afterthought. Yet now, with the curtains shifted and the mirror's pale shard throwing light upward, they seemed the very heart of the thing. A house keeps odd sermons hidden in plain sight, and sometimes one must only draw back a little cloth for them to begin preaching. Gideon crossed to the painting. He did not touch it. His hand lifted and stopped in the air just short of the frame, then fell again. "This was done the spring after Rowan was born," he said, and his voice had gone distant, not colder but farther away, as if he were speaking from a room behind his own ribs. She had insisted on planting those herself. Mud to the wrists. Belle scolded her. I told her the gardeners could do it better. Prudence waited. "She told me," he went on, with the faintest trace of broken amusement, "that men who inherit land imagine they have a greater understanding of bulbs than women who actually kneel in the soil." A silence followed that was different from the others, remembering. Then he turned away abruptly, as if the memory had burned him. "You should go." "Yes, Your Grace." This time she reached the door before anything stopped her. Her hand was on the latch when he spoke again. "Did my daughter tell you anything else?" Prudence glanced back. "About what, sir?" "About these rooms. About me." There was no safe answer to that. Still, the day had long since passed the point where safety could be mistaken for honesty. Prudence kept her hand on the latch and said, "Only that the dark frightened them." His jaw tightened. "And that Lady Clara remembers her mother laughing here," Prudence added, "because once truth is being told, stinginess with it becomes its own sort of lie. Children measure loss in the places where joy used to be. When those places are closed, they begin to think joy itself has been forbidden." He looked at her then with such naked weariness that for one startled instant he ceased to appear grand at all. Only human. Only a man who had mistaken endurance for faithfulness and had gone on mistaking it long after it began harming those he meant to protect. "You speak as if you know children," he said. "I was eldest of 5 before I was 12, she replied, "and buried 2 of them before I was 15. The words came out plain, with no adornment, and hung between them with the quiet weight of fact. Gideon did not offer sympathy. He was too intelligent for the empty sort, and too stricken by his own surprise to reach for the proper sort. But something altered in his face once more. Respect, perhaps, or the beginning of it. Sorrow recognizes labor when rank does not. A knock sounded at the half-open door. Mr. Vale's voice came through, dry as paper. "Your Grace, the vicar has arrived. He asks whether the memorial accounts are to be reviewed before supper." The Duke shut his eyes briefly. There it was again, that machinery of grief respectable people know so well. Ledgers, calls, formal remembrances, every polished ritual by which pain is made presentable, while the living go untended. He opened his eyes and looked once more toward the window, where the snowdrops still nodded below the sill. Then he said, without taking his gaze from them, "Tell the vicar to wait." Mr. Vale did not answer at once, and in that small hesitation, Prudence understood that something in Wintermere had just been challenged more dangerous than mourning itself. That hesitation outside the nursery door lasted only a second, but in a house governed by habit, a second can sound like rebellion. Mr. Vale answered at last, "Very good, Your Grace." And though his voice remained orderly, something in it had gone thin. Prudence heard his steps withdraw down the corridor toward the front rooms where the vicar waited with his black gloves, his condolences, and the proper papers of remembrance. Gideon said nothing more. He stood by the window a little longer, looking not at Prudence now, but at the patch below the wall where the snowdrops showed white against the winter earth. She understood then that she had been dismissed and forgotten in the same breath, which is a common enough fate for working women and still stings every time. She slipped out quietly. The passage beyond felt colder than the room she had left. Mrs. Bell was waiting there with the children, though waiting was too calm a word for Clara's rigid posture and Rowan's blotched face. The little boy seized Prudence's hand at once. "Are you coming back after supper?" he asked. Prudence knelt despite the ache in her knees. "No, lamb." His mouth crumpled. Clara stared past sorrow and into anger, which is often the safer country for the proud-hearted. "He cannot mean it," she said. "He says things and then keeps saying them because no one stops him." Mrs. Bell closed her eyes briefly at that, a loyal servant feeling truth strike where loyalty could not shield. Prudence rose and freed her hand gently. "Your father means what he says," she told the girl. "That is part of the trouble." Then, softer, because children deserve tenderness even when they cannot be helped, "Mind your brother, and if the room is dark again tonight, remember the flowers are still there under the window. Things do not stop growing because someone has covered the glass." Clara swallowed hard. It was plain she wanted to say a dozen dangerous things and did not know which would wound least. In the end, she only asked, "Will you tell me where to find you?" Prudence did not answer that. Hope is a sweetmeat best not given to the grieving unless one can be sure of more. She climbed to the attic under the eaves where the lower servants slept, and there the house met her in the way houses always meet disgrace, through whispers pretending not to be heard. A scullery maid paused with an armful of damp linen and stared. A footman near the back stair lowered his voice as she passed, which told her he had been speaking of her already. By the time she reached her room, her dismissal had gone ahead of her like smoke. Her possessions were few: a second gown, mended at both cuffs, a comb with 2 missing teeth, a prayer book that had belonged to her mother, a bit of ribbon she kept for no reason she could justify. She laid them one by one into her small valise while the wind rattled the dormer pane above her narrow bed. From the courtyard far below came the clatter of wheels, then the front bell, then silence again. A few minutes later there was a knock. Mrs. Bell entered without waiting, carrying a wrapped heel of bread and a scrap of cheese in her apron pocket. Her face was flushed from haste. "Eat while you can," she said, "and don't go down yet." Prudence looked up sharply. "Why?" Mrs. Bell set the food on the bed and lowered her voice to a whisper. "Because the vicar has been kept cooling his heels for half an hour, and his grace has shut himself inside her ladyship's room." Prudence set the bread untouched on the bedspread and stared at Mrs. Bell as if the old nurse had spoken in some foreign tongue. "In her ladyship's dressing room?" Mrs. Bell nodded, breath a little short from climbing the servant's stair in haste. "He went in there himself, shut the door, wouldn't have Vale, wouldn't have me, and the vicar has been pacing the little green parlor like a crow on a wall, pretending patience." She lowered her voice further. "I have worked in this house since before his grace had whiskers. I have never known him keep a clergyman waiting for anything." That, more than the words themselves, struck home. Men like Gideon are trained from childhood to neglect comfort, sleep, affection, even their own hearts if rank requires it. But ceremony is the language by which great houses excuse themselves to the world. To leave a vicar cooling his heels while one shut oneself inside a dead wife's room, that was not forgetfulness, that was disruption. Prudence sat slowly on the narrow bed. The mattress gave a weary sigh beneath her. Through the little dormer came the sound of wind dragging over the roof slates and the faint cawing of rooks settling in the bare elms. Evening was drawing in. Soon lamps would be lit below stairs, kettles shifted, bells rung, trays carried. Wintermere would go on being Wintermere, because houses always try to go on, even while something in them is changing shape. "You should eat," said Mrs. Bell. "I have no stomach for it." "No, nor I." The old woman came a little nearer. "But a body must sometimes be persuaded to endure what the spirit objects to." Prudence almost smiled at that, though not quite. "If he has dismissed me, what does it matter where he has gone?" Mrs. Bell looked at her sharply, with that deep servant intelligence which misses very little and comments on even less. "Because men do not lock themselves into old grief unless the grief has begun talking back." The words settled in the room. Prudence thought of the painting, the snowdrops, the pale strip of mirror. She thought of Gideon standing still as a struck bell while something long muted rang through him. She thought, too, of her own position, which remained entirely plain however stirred the Duke might be in private. She was turned off. By morning she might be on the road with her valise and a week's wages. One does not build futures out of cracks in aristocratic sorrow. That way lies ruin for women with no cushion beneath them. And yet, she said aloud before she meant to. Mrs. Bell's brows rose. Prudence shook her head. "Nothing." The nurse moved to the door, then paused. "The children will not settle," she said. "Lady Clara says if the cloth is put back she'll go at it with the nursery scissors. Master Rowan has asked 6 times whether you are truly leaving. I told him I did not know. It was the nearest thing to truth I had." When she had gone, Prudence sat alone in the attic room with the dim light thinning across the floorboards and her little valise half-packed beside her. She meant to finish it. She meant to tie the straps, wrap her shawl, and make herself ready for the cold certainty ahead. Instead, she found herself listening to something else, a pause where there ought to have been motion, a held breath in the bones of Wintermere. Then, far below, a bell rang once from the Duchess's wing. And no one in that house had touched that bell cord since Lady Margery died. The bell's single note seemed to climb the walls of the house and hang there. Prudence was on her feet before she quite knew she had risen. Mrs. Bell, halfway through the doorway, turned so sharply her cap strings fluttered against her throat. For a breath, both women simply listened, because some sounds carry more than noise with them. This one carried memory, service, habit, the ghost of old routine. That bell had once summoned hot water, fresh linen, hairpins, tea trays, laughter, impatience, ordinary life. After Lady Margery died, it had fallen silent, and silence, once settled in a house, begins to imagine it has rights. "He's rung," whispered Mrs. Bell. "So he has." Mrs. Bell stared at Prudence as if the next fact were too absurd to name and must nevertheless be named. "That bell calls for a woman's maid." Prudence let out one small breath. "And there is none now. Not since the funeral. He knows that." Mrs. Bell's lined face tightened with a strange blend of fear and hope. "Unless he does not know it. Unless he pulled the cord by blind habit." Then, after a beat, "Or unless he knows exactly what he is about." Neither of them spoke the thing beneath that thing, because to speak it aloud would give it too much body. Yet it stood between them plainly enough. If Gideon had meant nothing by the bell, then Wintermere was merely startled. If he had meant something, the whole house was poised on an edge. From below came the muted stir of servants in confusion. A door opened. Quick feet crossed the passage beneath the attic stairs and stopped. Someone said, "Did you hear?" Someone else answered, "From her rooms, God help us." In great houses, gossip does not travel like conversation. It moves like current under floorboards. You feel it before you hear it. Mrs. Bell drew herself up. "Stay here." Prudence gave her a look. "You know I won't." "No," said Mrs. Bell, with the ghost of dry humor returning even now. "I begin to know precisely what sort of woman you are." She came back into the room, took Prudence by the wrist, and pressed something small and cold into her palm. It was a key, blackened with age, ribbon-tied and worn smooth at the stem. "The little side door into her room, the servant's way. If he asks for anything—" She did not finish. Prudence looked down at the key. "Bell." "He rang," she said simply. There are moments when obedience ceases to be servility and becomes witness. Prudence did not know whether she was being drawn toward reprieve or disgrace more complete than before, perhaps both. Still, she slipped the key into her pocket and followed Mrs. Bell down the back stair, the narrow one with the dip in the center of each step where generations of unseen feet had passed. The air grew colder as they descended, touched by stone and dusk. At the turn toward the Duchess's wing, they met two maids huddled together, white-faced with excitement, and beyond them a footman from the front hall who looked as though he had been sent to spy and had found the errand more than he liked. "Is it true?" one maid whispered. Mrs. Bell did not pause. "Go about your business." At the corridor entrance, Mr. Vale stood rigid beneath the dim wall lamps, the vicar at his shoulder in black broadcloth and offended patience. The steward's gaze fell at once on Prudence, and the color rose hard in his cheeks. "You," he said, "you were dismissed." Before Prudence could answer, from behind the closed door of Lady Margery's room came the bell again, twice this time, clear and unmistakable. The second summons left no room for pretense. Mr. Vale's face hardened at once, as though sound itself had insulted him. The vicar blinked, glanced toward the closed dressing-room door, and then toward the steward, uncertain whether he was witnessing grief, impropriety, or some aristocratic custom too elevated for explanation. Mrs. Bell's hand found Prudence's sleeve and tightened there for the briefest instant. It was not permission exactly. It was the opposite of restraint. "Your Grace has rung," she said. The steward drew himself up. "His Grace is indisposed. I shall attend." He took one step toward the door. From within came no voice, only the silence that follows when a man has asked for something and expects the household to understand the language of bells. Prudence knew that silence. Every servant knows it. There is a difference between a summons meant for whoever is nearest and one meant by instinct for a particular pair of hands. The old bell cord had once called a woman who knew the room, the drawers, the water jug, the brushes, the habits of the lady who lived there. That woman was long gone. So was the lady. Yet the bell had rung twice. Mrs. Bell spoke before the steward could lay hold of the latch. "He did not ring for you." Mr. Vale turned on her with cold fury. "This is becoming absurd." "Is it?" said the nurse. It was a dangerous question to ask a man like him before witnesses. You could feel the vicar shrinking inward from the household storm, wishing himself back at his own modest fire with his tea and his parish ledgers. But the great houses of the world are always most revealing when respectable outsiders happen to be present, because rank must then decide whether it will cling to appearances or to truth. It cannot hold both forever. His gaze shifted to Prudence. "You will leave this corridor at once." Prudence might have obeyed. The order was plain, so was her dismissal. But then the bell gave a faint, impatient tremor from within the room, not fully rung this time, only touched, as if the grip on the cord had changed its mind midway and still could not let it lie. That did it. Mrs. Bell said, "Open the door." "No." The old nurse's face altered. "Then I shall." For one astonished heartbeat, even Mr. Vale seemed unsure whether to physically block a woman who had once carried the Duke himself as an infant. That pause was all Prudence needed. She stepped past them, drew the little side key from her pocket, and moved to the narrow servants' panel set almost flush with the wall beside the main door. Vale saw the key too late. "Mrs. Hale!" But the lock had already turned. The panel opened inward on a dim dressing room smelling of cold ashes, lavender water long gone stale, and the faint dust of things untouched. The shutters there were still half veiled. A silver-backed brush lay on the dressing table beside a folded handkerchief, yellowed at the edge. One candle had been lit and guttered low, and Gideon was not at the table at all. He was standing before the large mirror in the corner, his hand braced on its frame where the black cloth had slipped half away, leaving his own reflection and Lady Margery's empty room revealed together. His face in the glass looked stricken and astonished, as though he had finally met a man he had been avoiding for months. He turned at the sound of the opening panel and saw Prudence there. And instead of anger, he said only, in a voice roughened past pride, "You came." The words were so simple that they nearly undid her more than any grand declaration might have done. You came. A fact spoken with surprise in it, and something very near relief. Prudence stood just inside the panel door with the chill from the corridor still on her face, while beyond her shoulders she could feel, rather than see, the outrage of Mr. Vale, the strained vigilance of Mrs. Bell, the vicar's bewildered stillness. But the room had narrowed. There was only Gideon before the mirror, one strip of cloth hanging loose from the frame, candle smoke faint in the air, and the old scent of lavender trapped in fabrics that had not properly breathed in months. "You rang, Your Grace?" she said. He looked as though he had forgotten the bell even existed until she named it. His bare hand slipped from the frame. In the glass behind him, Prudence saw both of them together for the first time. The Duke in black, gaunt from mourning, the dismissed charwoman with attic dust on her hem and a side key still warm in her palm. There was something almost indecent in the honesty of a mirror. It arranges no rank. It flatters no title. It only returns what is placed before it and waits to see if the living can bear themselves. Behind Prudence, Mr. Vale found his voice. "Your Grace, if you require attendance, I am here." Gideon did not turn. "I did not ring for you." The steward drew breath, affronted into silence. Prudence might have retreated then. Perhaps she should have. Yet Gideon was still looking at her in the glass with that same unsettled directness, and there are moments when moving away from a person feels less like obedience than abandonment. So she stayed. "What do you need, sir?" she asked quietly. For a heartbeat, he seemed not to know. That, more than anything else, shook the room. Powerful men are expected always to know what they require, even if what they require is disastrous. To stand in one's dead wife's room before an uncovered mirror and have no command ready, it stripped him bare in a way his title could not conceal. Then his gaze shifted to the table beside the fireless grate. On it lay a small carved box of dark wood, half hidden under a folded pair of gloves. "That," he said. Prudence crossed to it. The box was lighter than it looked. Rosewood, rubbed smooth at the corners by use. When she opened it, the hinges gave a soft click. Inside, nestled in pale blue silk, lay several dried snowdrop petals, brittle as paper, and a narrow ribbon tied around a lock of light brown hair. Mrs. Bell made a sound at the door, not loud, but full of years. "Oh, my lady." Gideon finally turned from the mirror. His face had lost all that rigid composure he wore for the rest of the world. She kept everything, he said, almost apologizing for Margery's tenderness and mourning it in the same breath. A child's first curl, a petal from the first bloom each year, notes, trifles, proofs of days I walked through without understanding their value. Prudence closed the lid gently. And now? He looked toward the shrouded windows, the dimness, the black cloth, the room that had become a vault because he had lacked the courage to let it remain a room. Now I find I cannot remember whether I covered these things to honor her, he said, or to prevent myself from seeing what I had become without her. That was the truth at last, or near enough to make the air tremble. From the corridor came Clara's voice, sharp and thin with contained tears. "Papa?" Gideon's eyes lifted, and in that instant, as if the house itself had chosen its moment, the wind pressed hard against the outer panes, and one of the loosened window veils tore free from its fastening with a long, ripping sound. The tearing sound ran through the room, a seam giving way in something larger than cloth. All at once the loosened veil dropped from the window in a black rush, dragging another fastening loose as it fell. Cold evening light came in broad and pale, no timid stripe now, but a full wash across the dressing table, across the faded carpet, across Gideon's face and Prudence's hands, and the mirror that had already told too much. Outside, beyond the glass, the garden under the south wall lay open to sight. The snowdrops shone white in clusters, little bowed heads lifted by the wind, as if the earth itself had been waiting for witness. Mrs. Bell made the sign of the cross before she could stop herself. Mr. Vale said, "Shut that window at once." No one moved. You must understand what that moment was inside such a house. It was not only that the room had brightened, it was that the old arrangement of things had been contradicted by the room itself. For months the order had been darkness, and now the daylight had entered without permission and proved the order foolish. Pride can argue with servants. It cannot argue half so well with weather. Clara, who had slipped nearer in the confusion, stood just beyond the door with Rowan tucked against her side. Their faces, lit by the opened room, seemed younger all at once, as if fear had been drawing them old and the light had remembered to return them to childhood. Rowan pointed through the pane. "The flowers," he whispered. "Papa, look! Mama's flowers." Gideon did look. He looked as though he had never truly done so before. The wind had moved a branch aside, and from this angle the whole small border could be seen, untidy and brave under winter's hand. Margery's snowdrops had gone on blooming in the dark, while he sat below stairs among memorial papers and called that devotion. Something in his face gave way then, not noisily, not with the grandeur of public grief, but with the far more terrible quiet of private recognition. He crossed to the window. Mr. Vale made one last attempt to restore the old world. "Your Grace, the cloth must be rehung before the cold damages the room." Gideon took the latch and opened the casement wider. A hard breath of evening air swept in, carrying damp earth, frost, and the clean, bitter smell of winter leaves. The candle on the dressing table guttered and went out. The black mourning crepe pooled there, lifted at one edge like dead water stirred. "No," the Duke said. The single word stopped everyone. He did not raise his voice. He stood at the open window with the light on him and the garden below and repeated it in the same steady tone. "No." This time he turned from the flowers and looked first at his children, then at Mrs. Bell, then at Prudence, and at last at Mr. Vale. It was the first time he had looked at them all together in that room, as if the house had contained separate worlds until now, and he had only just been made to understand that they had been living under one roof all along. "I have had enough of shadows," he said. The vicar, poor man, let out the smallest involuntary breath, because he had not come to hear a confession, and yet one was happening in front of him all the same. Gideon bent, took up the fallen length of black cloth from the boards, and held it in both hands for a moment, as if weighing what it had cost him. Then he turned toward the corridor and said, "Send word through the house. I want every servant in the great hall." And every soul standing there knew the next thing he said would alter Wintermere forever. The order flew through Wintermere faster than any dinner bell ever had. By the time Gideon came down from the Duchess's wing, the great hall was filling with servants in every shade of alarm. Housemaids with red hands still damp from rinsing linen. Footmen half-buttoned called from the lower corridor. The cook peering from the passage beyond the baize door, flower on one sleeve. The vicar, stranded among them by circumstance and dignity, stood near the hearth with his hat clutched too tightly and his eyes fixed on nothing. Mr. Vale had arranged himself at one side of the room in the rigid posture of a man who intends to survive a humiliation by standing very straight through it. Prudence had been told to remain, not by Mrs. Bell this time, nor by the children, but by Gideon himself, in a voice that admitted no retreat and offered no explanation. So she stood near the foot of the stairs with the old nurse beside her, and Clara and Rowan pressed close, the little boy's fingers tucked into the fold of her skirt, as though he meant to anchor her to the house by sheer childish will. The hall smelled of damp wool, banked fire, beeswax, and cold stone. Above, the antlers and portraits watched with their usual blank inheritance. Great houses pretend to be permanent. That is part of their vanity. Yet let one truth be spoken aloud in the right room, and you discover how quickly permanence begins to tremble. When Gideon entered, the murmuring stopped. He had changed nothing about his dress, no ceremonial coat, no effort to compose the scene into grandeur. He came as he was, with the light from the reopened rooms still somehow clinging to him, and halted on the lowest stair rather than the top, which placed him nearer the household than rank ordinarily permitted. He looked over them all in a difficult silence now, earned silence. "At my instruction," he said, "Lady Margery's rooms were shrouded after her death. Every window veiled, every mirror covered, no curtain drawn, no air admitted. I gave that order, and this house obeyed it." No one stirred. "I gave it in grief," he went on. "I maintained it in pride." The words struck the room like a hand striking water flat. Mr. Vale's face changed almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Bell bowed her head. Prudence did not move at all. She knew enough of the world to understand the rarity of what was happening. Men will confess sins to God, sometimes to priests, occasionally to themselves. To confess an error before servants, that is a different order of humility. "My children have feared those rooms," Gideon said. "The air in them has gone stale. The windows have hidden a garden my wife planted with her own hands. And I, who believed myself faithful to her memory, have in fact made a monument of darkness where she would have wanted light." Clara's breath caught. Rowan leaned harder against Prudence. Gideon turned then, and all eyes followed his gaze to her. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "disobeyed me." A ripple went through the hall. Truth is often more frightening when it agrees with accusation before it overturns it. "She disobeyed me," he repeated, "because everyone else in this house obeyed me too well." And even before he spoke the next words, Wintermere knew the old order had broken and could not be mended by mere cloth again. The silence after that sentence was unlike any Prudence had ever heard in Wintermere. It was not the silence of fear alone, though fear was in it, nor only surprise. It was the silence of a whole household discovering that the truth had been standing among them in a work apron, saying the plain thing, while rank and ritual have been speaking in finer language and meaning less. Those are the moments, rare and costly, when the order of the world does not quite reverse, but is shown for what it is, a scaffolding, useful in places, foolish in others, and never strong enough to support a lie forever. Mr. Vale stepped forward because someone had to, and men who serve systems tend to mistake themselves for the spine of them. Your Grace," he said carefully, "Mrs. Hale's conduct still constitutes grave insubordination. However your feelings may have altered, the example—" "The example?" Gideon turned his gaze on him fully. "Yes, let us speak of that." The steward fell silent. "The example," Gideon said, "is that I made a wrong command, and because it was mine, none of you dared question it. A child dared it. Belle dared it. Mrs. Hale dared it. The rest of you obeyed a folly until the house itself began to sour." His voice did not rise. If anything, it deepened, which was worse for those hearing it. "That is not loyalty. It is cowardice dressed in good service." Mr. Vale went white, not because the words were false, but because they were spoken before witnesses and by the one mouth in the house that could make them law. Prudence, who had never expected to see a duke defend her against the steward of his own house, felt the moment pass through her almost like weakness. Triumph would have come easier, something stranger. The deep unsteadiness of being seen at last by someone whose notice could alter the ground beneath one's feet. Gideon turned back to the household. "Hear me, all of you. My order regarding Lady Margery's wing is undone. The veils are to come down, every window opened when weather permits, every mirror uncovered, fires laid where they are needed. The children are not to be kept from their mothers' rooms, and the garden below the south wall is to be set right and tended." At that, Clara gave a sharp, astonished sob that became laughter before she could stop it. Rowan clutched Prudence's hand so hard his little nails bit her skin. Mrs. Bell bowed her head and openly wept. Still, Gideon was not finished. "As for Mrs. Hale," he said, and now the room drew breath all over again, because this was the matter at its hot center. "I dismissed her in anger while still half blind. That dismissal is withdrawn." The words landed like warmth after frost. Small sounds broke from the servants, half gasps, half shifts, the human noises people make when justice, having been despaired of, arrives bluntly in the room among them. Prudence did not move. She could not. She had imagined disgrace, departure, perhaps a hard winter. She had not imagined public restoration. There are mercies so abrupt they feel at first like another kind of danger. Gideon looked straight at her. "If she will consent to remain." Will consent. Consent, not command or decree. That too went through the room like a second revelation, and through Prudence most of all. Because once a great man asks rather than orders, everyone present must reckon with the fact that something has indeed changed. All eyes turned to her, and before Prudence could answer, a voice came clear from the back of the hall, the cook, flowers still on her sleeve, saying what half the household had already begun thinking. "Well, if Mrs. Hale stays, somebody ought to know what place she's staying in now." The cook's blunt question broke the hall's spell in the most useful way. A little ripple went through the servants, not quite laughter, not quite shock. Human breath returning, that was all. And sometimes breath is what keeps a room from hardening into theater. Prudence, who had felt all eyes on her like heat on a kettle lid, was grateful for the interruption, even while it made her pulse jump. Because the woman was right. Fine words are all very well, but bread is bought with particulars. A life is altered not by being admired in public for half a minute, but by knowing what follows when the hall empties and the candles are snuffed. Gideon seemed to understand that too. He descended the last step and came to stand on the same level as the household, the same level as Prudence. "A fair question," he said. Then, looking at her and not away, "Mrs. Hale, if you are willing to remain, it will not be as if this afternoon had not occurred, and it will not be on sufferance." The words settled slowly. Prudence felt the children lean toward him before they even moved. Clara's face had gone intent and shining. Rowan, who understood little of adult forms and everything of whether someone he loved might stay, simply stared up with his mouth slightly open. Gideon went on. My wife's rooms must be restored. The nursery, the dressing room, the sitting room, the garden below the south wall. My children require those places made fit for the living again, not preserved for the dead at the expense of the living. Belle cannot carry it alone. Vale does not understand what is needed there. A fractional pause, and in that pause even Mr. Vale had the decency to look stung rather than disputatious. You do. There it was. Recognition in plain dress. Prudence should have answered at once, yet the whole hall seemed to wait on her next breath, and she could not forget so quickly who she was and what the world was. The rush of gratitude people expect in such moments did not come. Something harder and more honest rose instead. Caution, self-respect. The old knowledge that a woman may be praised one minute and patronized the next if she does not secure the truth of the matter while she can. So she said carefully, "And if I stay, Your Grace, what am I to the house?" A little murmur again. Bold, that question, but not impertinent. Not now. Gideon answered without haste, as if he'd already begun turning it over before descending to the hall. Keeper of the wing, he said, with authority over its restoration, over those assigned to it, and direct answer to me in that business. Prudence heard Mrs. Bell breathe out beside her. The children looked at one another as if a door had opened inside a door. Still she did not answer, because there was another truth in the room, and if she left it unspoken she would be agreeing to her own diminishment in finer clothing. "And below stairs?" she asked. "What am I there? A curiosity? A servant raised over other servants because she crossed you and happened to be right once?" Gideon's gaze did not flicker. No. It was a strong answer, plain. Yet Prudence had lived too long by plain things not to test them before trusting them. Mr. Vale, who perhaps hoped to save some remnant of old order, said stiffly, "Surely such details may be settled privately." "No," said Clara unexpectedly from her place by Prudence's skirt. "Privately is how people go back on things." The hall went very still again, and Gideon, looking at his daughter, then at Prudence, said, "Very well. Publicly, then. Ask what you need, Mrs. Hale." The question hung in the hall like a lantern held up over deep water. Ask what you need. Before servants, steward, vicar, children, and the old portraits looking down from their gilt frames. Prudence had never in her life been invited to name her terms to a man above her station, let alone a duke before his whole household. Such invitations can be traps. They can also be doors. Wisdom lies in knowing which is which, and courage in stepping through when the door is real. She felt Rowan's grip still tucked in her skirt, Clara's fierce little hope beside her, Mrs. Bell's breath held. She felt, too, the stare of Mr. Vale, who would have preferred this whole business tidied back into silence by the oldest methods, dismissal, embarrassment, a purse pressed into the wronged hand, and the return of darkness behind closed doors. A house can survive scandal more easily than it survives truth if truth begins teaching the lower people what they may ask. Prudence lifted her chin. "If I stay," she said, "the rooms stay open. Open past a week, past the talk dying down." Gideon answered at once. "They stay open." "And the children go where they please in their mother's rooms." "They do." "And no one," she said, and now her eyes went not to him, but to the line of servants, and to Mr. Vale among them, "is to make a punished thing of this afterward, not with whispers, not with duties turned spiteful, not by calling me above myself because I did what any soul with sense and eyes should have done." A murmur stirred and died. Gideon's voice came steady. "No one will." Prudence took a breath. There was one more thing, and it was the true one. Without it, all the rest would only be better manners laid over the same old contempt. "And I will not be hidden," she said. "If I am keeper of that wing, then I am that plainly. I won't skulk in the back passage doing the work while others take the name of it. I won't be made useful in secret and shameful in public." The vicar looked startled by the force of her. Mrs. Bell, on the other hand, looked as if she might have smiled had the moment allowed. Gideon did not flinch. "You will not be hidden." For a heartbeat, Prudence thought that was all. Then he added, and his gaze did not leave hers, "I have hidden enough for the both of us." Something warm and dangerous moved through the room at that, not because the words were romantic, he was too raw for polished romance, but because they were naked. People who have spent years speaking through custom are always most arresting when they stop. Clara gave a little sound, almost a laugh through tears. Rowan simply said, with the certainty of the very young, "Then she'll stay." Prudence might have answered then. Every heart in that hall expected it. But life has taught plain women not to leap just because kindness appears. Kindness can falter if it has no shape to hold it. So she said, "One more thing, Your Grace." Even Gideon seemed taken aback now, though not displeased. "Name it." Prudence looked toward the great doors of the hall, where the night pressed black at the panes, and then back to him. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "before breakfast, before anyone in this house can pretend tonight was only talk, I want the veils brought down by your order and in your sight, every last one, windows and mirrors both." A hush answered her, because now she was asking not for pardon nor place, but proof. Gideon stood very still, and then, before the whole house, he began to reply. He did not leave it for mourning. Gideon looked at Prudence, then at the gathered household, and said, "No. Now, not tomorrow." He handed the fallen length of black crepe to the nearest footman, as if returning a useless relic to history. "Lanterns," he said. "Stepladders. Every covering in that wing comes down tonight, before any of us can lose our nerve and call hesitation prudence." For half a second no one moved, because people trained by hierarchy sometimes need a second command when the first one asks them to become human again. Then the room broke into motion. Footmen fetched ladders. Maids came with baskets for the cloth. Mrs. Bell laughed and cried in the same breath. Clara caught Rowan's hand and dragged him toward the stair, both children wild-eyed with exhausted joy. Even the vicar, abandoned by propriety and perhaps relieved to be useful at last, took hold of a lantern and went up with the rest. And Prudence, standing in the middle of that sudden turning, felt Gideon's gaze on her still. "Well," he said quietly. She had made him answer publicly. It was only right that she do the same. "I will stay," she said, "if the rooms are for the living from this night forward." "They are," he answered. So the work began. They moved through Lady Margery's wing like people opening windows after a fever. Black cloth came down in heavy folds, releasing months of dust and stale air. Veiled mirrors gave back candlelight first, then faces, startled and intent and strangely younger for being seen. Casements were cracked open against the cold, fires were laid and coaxed to life. In the nursery, Rowan clapped when the last hanging fell from the tall window. In the dressing room, Clara stood very still before her mother's uncovered glass and then smiled at her own reflection, as if testing whether the room remembered how. Gideon took down one length himself, climbing the ladder in his shirt sleeves, while Vale stood below, white with disapproval and helpless to stop a single thing. When he stepped down, cloth over one arm, he caught Prudence watching him and said in a tone meant for her alone, "You were right about the air." "And the damp," she said. A tired, genuine smile reached his mouth then, the first she had seen there. And the damp. By dawn, the last of it was gone. The black mourning crepe lay heaped in the courtyard, wet with mist, looking suddenly small and foolish under the paling sky. Along the south wall, the snowdrops stood open in the first gray light, and the nursery windows above them were clear. Prudence paused there with cold fingers wrapped around a mug of tea, and Gideon came to stand beside her without ceremony. They said nothing. They did not need to. The children were laughing upstairs, and that sound was answer enough. A house may survive on stone and money, but it begins to live again only when someone dares to uncover what grief has hidden from itself. By morning, the windows were bare, the mirrors honest, and the frost had not killed the flowers after all. In the thin sunrise, Clara pressed her palm to the glass from inside, and outside the snowdrops trembled in the wind as if the earth were breathing easier. If this story stayed with you, leave a word below and let me know. And if you'd like another long tale like this one, you're welcome to stay close for the next.